You are 60 years old. You have one eye. You are leading an army of farmers armed with pitchforks and homemade guns against the greatest military machine on the planet, the crusading knights of the Holy Roman Empire. You win. Then a stray arrow takes your other eye. Now you are completely blind. What do? You keep fighting. And you keep winning. You never lose, not once. This isn't a fantasy novel. This is the story of Jan Žižka, the most terrifying, innovative, and successful general you've probably never heard of. His story is about more than just battles. It's about how an old, disabled man turned the medieval world upside down and laid the blueprint for modern warfare. If you want to understand how history is truly forged, not by kings, but by conviction and ingenuity, you're in the right place. Stick around and make sure you're subscribed, because this is a story that changes how you see the world. Our story begins not on a battlefield, but in a church. The year is 1415. The Kingdom of Bohemia, what we now call the Czech Republic, is a spiritual powder keg. A reformist preacher named Jan Hus has been challenging the authority and corruption of the Catholic Church. He argued people should receive communion in both kinds, bread and wine, a direct defiance of Rome. For this, the Church declared him a heretic and burned him at the stake. They thought they had extinguished a fire. Instead, they ignited an inferno. The death of Hus enraged the Bohemian people. They saw it as an attack on their faith and their national identity. 4 years later, in 1419, that rage boiled over. A procession of Hussite radicals marched on the new town hall in Prague. They demanded the release of their imprisoned comrades. An official mocked them from a window. Someone threw a stone. The Hussites stormed the building and threw the Catholic council members out of the window to their deaths on the pikes of the crowd below. This was the first defenestration of Prague. It was an act of rebellion. It was a declaration of war. And who was there watching this chaos unfold? A 60-year-old courtier of the king, a man named Jan Žižka. He was no stranger to violence. He had spent most of his life as a mercenary, a soldier for hire. He fought for the Poles against the Teutonic Knights at the Battle of Grunwald, one of the largest battles of the Middle Ages. He had likely lost his first eye in a youthful skirmish. He wasn't a noble lord with vast lands and a private army. He was a minor gentry, a professional soldier who understood one thing better than anyone else: how to kill. When the Hussite rebellion exploded, Zizka, a fervent believer in Hus's teachings, saw his moment. He left the royal court and offered his military expertise to the rebels. The Hussites had passion, they had faith, but they didn't have an army. They were brewers, blacksmiths, farmers, and peasants. The Pope, seeing this rebellion, called for a crusade. He promised salvation to any knight who would ride to Bohemia and crush these heretics. The most powerful, best equipped, and most experienced warriors in Europe answered the call. It was farmers versus knights, amateurs versus professionals. It should have been a slaughter. Žižka looked at his so-called army and knew they couldn't fight the knights on their own terms. A farmer with a pitchfork stood no chance against a man in full plate armor on a war horse. So he didn't try. He changed the rules of the game. He looked at what they had. They had farm tools. He took the flail, used for beating grain, and added spikes to its head. This became a terrifying weapon that could crush a helmet or shatter a shield. He took the scythe and straightened the blade, turning it into a deadly pole arm. But his true genius was seeing the potential in two seemingly ordinary things: the common farm cart and the new, unreliable technology of gunpowder. He understood that these peasants couldn't win with skill or swordsmanship. They had to win with discipline, technology, and tactics that the knights had never seen before and would not know how to counter. He drilled them relentlessly, not as individual fighters, but as a cohesive unit, a machine built of faith and iron. This is where the farm cart comes in. Individually, it's just a wagon, but Žižka saw something else. He saw a mobile fortress. He ordered his men to reinforce their carts with thick wooden planks and even metal plates. On the battlefield, they would form these carts into a circle or a square, chaining them together wheel to wheel. This was the Wagenburg, the wagon fort. It was a revolutionary idea. The knights' greatest weapon was the cavalry charge, a thundering wave of steel that could shatter any infantry line. But they couldn't charge a wall of wagons. The Wagenburg broke their momentum. It funneled the attackers into narrow killing zones, right into the sights of the Hussite crossbowmen, archers, and his newest secret weapon. Inside this wooden fortress, the peasants were no longer exposed. They were protected. They had the high ground, and they could rain down death on the frustrated knights who were stuck outside, easy targets. And what was that secret weapon? Gunpowder. While large cannons existed, they were slow and difficult to move. Žižka embraced a smaller, more personal firearm, the pistola, which literally means pipe or whistle. This was one of the world's first effective hand cannons. It was essentially a small cannon on a wooden pole. It was inaccurate, slow to reload, and prone to misfiring, but Žižka wasn't using it for sharpshooting. He was using it for terror. Imagine being a knight in 1420. You've trained your whole life in the art of combat. You believe God is on your side. Suddenly, this wall of peasant wagons erupts with a sound you've never heard before, a deafening roar of thunder and smoke. Lead balls are punching through your friend's armor. It was psychological warfare. The noise, the smoke, the sheer alien nature of gunpowder weapons sowed panic and confusion in the Crusader ranks. It was the sound of a new age of warfare, an age where noble birth and expensive armor meant less than a steady hand and a pound of black powder. The first true test of these radical new ideas came in March 1420 at the Battle of Sudomir. Žižka was leading a small force of about 400 Hussites, including women and children, when they were cornered by 2,000 heavily armored Crusader knights. They were outnumbered 5-1. It was a trap. They were caught in the open on a narrow causeway between two drained, muddy fish ponds. Retreat was impossible. Surrender meant death. Any other commander would have seen this as a disaster. Žižka saw it as an opportunity. He used the terrain to his advantage. He anchored his flank against one of the ponds and quickly formed a defensive line with just 12 of his war wagons. The knights, arrogant and eager for a quick victory, charged, and they ran straight into Žižka's trap. Their heavy war horses, the tanks of their day, got bogged down in the wet, muddy ground of the drained pond beds. The charge lost all its momentum. The knights became a chaotic, struggling mass of men and horses sinking in the mud. From behind the safety of their wagon wall, the Hussites unleashed hell. Crossbow bolts and handgun shots tore into the immobilized knights. The few who managed to reach the wagons were met by peasants wielding those brutal spiked flails. Legend even says the Hussite women spread their cloaks and veils on the muddy ground, entangling the legs of the horses and tripping them. The elite knights of Christendom were being systematically dismantled by a handful of peasants using their own environment against them. As dusk fell, the Crusaders had had enough. Humiliated and bloodied, they were treated, leaving hundreds of their dead behind. Žižka's small band had suffered almost no casualties. Sudomir was a tiny battle in the grand scheme of things, but its impact was enormous. It proved that Žižka's bizarre tactics worked. It proved that farmers could defeat knights. It was a stunning victory that sent a shockwave across Europe and gave the Hussites something priceless: belief.
The Pope was furious. The defeated Sadamarch was an embarrassment. He called for a second, much larger crusade. This time, an army estimated at anywhere from 30,000 to 100,000 men, led by the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund himself, marched on Bohemia. Their target, the heart of the rebellion, the city of Prague. The city was besieged, cut off, and starving. The situation was desperate. The Crusaders' key to victory was a strategic ridge overlooking the city, Witkov Hill. It controlled the last remaining supply route into Prague. If the Crusaders took the hill, the city would fall. Žižka, now the supreme commander of the Hussite forces, knew this. He fortified the hill with a small, desperate force, building a crude fort of timber and stone. He himself was there with only a handful of men and women, holding the fate of the entire rebellion in their hands.
On July 14, 1420, Sigismund ordered the assault. Thousands of heavily armored knights from Meissen began the charge up the steep, vine-covered slopes of Witkov Hill. Žižka and his tiny garrison fought like cornered lions. The battle raged, a desperate hand-to-hand struggle on the ramparts of their small fort. The Hussites were being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. The line was about to break. It seemed like the end. But then, a miracle. A relief force from the city of Prague, led by a priest carrying the sacrament and ringing a church bell, charged out of the city gates and slammed into the rear of the attacking Crusaders. The sudden attack from behind, combined with the terrifying sound of the bells and the ferocious defense from the front, caused a wave of panic. The Crusaders thought they were being attacked by a much larger army. Their morale shattered. They broke and fled down the hill in a disorganized rout. A massive Crusader army was defeated by a handful of defenders and a timely, desperate charge. The siege of Prague was broken. Žižka had saved the revolution. Žižka was now a living legend, the hero of Witkov Hill, but his greatest challenge was yet to come. In 1421, during the siege of Rabi Castle, his luck finally ran out. An arrow fired from the castle walls struck him in his one good eye. The injury was catastrophic. The man who had revolutionized warfare with his keen tactical vision was now plunged into total, permanent darkness. He was completely blind. For any other leader, this would have been the end of their career. How can you command an army when you cannot see the battlefield? How can you lead a charge when you cannot see the enemy? The Crusaders celebrated. They believed their greatest nemesis was finally finished. They were wrong. For Jan Žižka, the war was just beginning. So how did he do it? How did a blind man continue to lead an army and never lose? He adapted. He created a system. He relied on his other senses, which were now heightened. He could supposedly tell the size and disposition of an enemy force just by the sound of their march. But more importantly, he trusted his subordinates. He surrounded himself with a cadre of loyal and intelligent officers. They became his eyes. They would describe the terrain, the enemy formations, and the flow of battle to him in meticulous detail. He would listen, process the information in his mind's eye, and then issue his commands. He had a map of every battlefield committed to memory. He used a complex system of flags and drum beats to signal his orders across the field. His blindness forced him to develop a more sophisticated and decentralized command structure, something far ahead of its time. He wasn't just leading, he was conducting a symphony of war, and he didn't need to see the orchestra to know if a single instrument was out of tune. His genius as a blind commander was put to the ultimate test in the winter of 1421 at the Battle of Kutna Hora. The Emperor Sigismund had returned with yet another Crusader army, trapping Žižka's forces against the city.
It was a pincer movement, a classic military maneuver designed to annihilate an enemy. Žižka was completely surrounded, outnumbered, and caught in the open. This time, there were no fish ponds or hills to help him. Any other army would have surrendered. Žižka decided to attack. In the dead of night, he formed his entire army into one massive column, with the war wagons leading the way like an armored spearhead. He ordered his artillery to fire a deafening barrage at one section of the enemy line. Under the cover of darkness and the shock of the cannonade, he charged. He used the Wagenburg not as a defensive fortress, but as an offensive battering ram. The Crusaders, stunned by the audacity of a night attack from a surrounded army, panicked and their line broke. Žižka's entire army punched through the encirclement and escaped, with their enemies too confused to even give chase. But Žižka wasn't content with just escaping. A few days later, after his army had rested, he turned around and attacked his pursuers. The Crusader army, thinking the Hussites were on the run, was caught completely by surprise. At the Battle of Niemiecki Brod, Žižka inflicted one of the most crushing defeats of the entire war. He didn't just beat them, he annihilated them. The Crusader army disintegrated, and the Emperor Sigismund himself barely escaped with his life. It was a masterclass in strategy. Surrounded and blind, Žižka had not only saved his army, but had turned the tables and destroyed his enemy. It cemented his reputation as an invincible, almost supernatural figure. How do you defeat a man who can't see but knows your every move? But we can't ignore the darker side of this story. Jan Žižka was not a gentle hero. He was a man of absolute, unbending religious conviction, and he was utterly ruthless. He saw the world in black and white, the faithful and the enemies of God, and the enemies of God deserved no mercy. His campaigns were often brutal affairs. He waged a war of terror against Catholic strongholds, particularly monasteries, which he saw as dens of corruption. He would offer a garrison two choices: surrender and convert, or die. He often kept his word. Towns were sacked, monasteries were burned to the ground, and their inhabitants, including priests and monks, were often massacred. To his followers, he was a divine instrument, the flail of God. To his enemies, he was a monster, a blind demon leaving a trail of fire and death across the land. The truth, as always, is probably somewhere in the middle. He was a product of a brutal age, fighting a total war for what he believed was the very soul of his people. As if fighting off all of Christendom wasn't enough, Žižka also had to contend with divisions within his own movement. The Hussites were not a unified bloc. They were split into factions. The more moderate faction, the Utraquists, were based in Prague and wanted to find a compromise with the church. Then there were the radicals, the Taborites, of which Žižka was the leader. They had founded their own city, Tabor, and lived by a strict, communal, and apocalyptic interpretation of the Bible. They wanted to tear down the old world completely. These factions often fought amongst themselves, even as Crusader armies were marching towards them. Žižka, with his immense prestige, was one of the few figures who could hold this fragile alliance together. He even had to fight and win battles against other Hussite factions who he felt were betraying the cause, always trying to steer the revolution back to its radical roots. By 1424, Jan Žižka was in his mid-60s. He was blind, scarred, and had been fighting almost non-stop for 5 years. But he showed no signs of slowing down. He was preparing for another campaign, this time into Moravia, planning to carry the war deeper into enemy territory. He had faced down 5 separate crusades sent by the most powerful rulers in Europe and had defeated every single one of them.
He had won over a dozen major field battles and countless smaller skirmishes. He had never been defeated in a pitched battle. His army, the warriors of God, was the most feared fighting force in Europe. They were loyal to him and only him. They followed their blind general with a devotion that bordered on worship. But in the end, Jan Žižka was defeated, not by a knight's lance or a cannonball, but by an enemy no soldier can fight: disease. While besieging the castle of Přibyslav, he contracted the plague. On October 11, 1424, the blind general who had never lost a battle died. His end was not glorious. It was not in the heat of combat where he had lived his life. It was a quiet, agonizing death in a campaign tent. The invincible warlord was, after all, mortal. His followers were devastated. They had lost their leader, their inspiration, their father figure. They felt so lost without him that they began to call themselves the Siratsi, the orphans. And here his story enters the realm of legend. It is said that Žižka's dying wish was that his skin should be flayed from his body and used to make a drum. This way he could continue to lead his men into battle even after death. The very sound of the Žižka drum would strike terror into the hearts of their enemies. Is this story true? Almost certainly not. It was likely a piece of propaganda created later to enhance his terrifying mythos. But the fact that people believed it, the fact that it became part of his legend, tells you everything you need to know about the fear and awe he inspired. He was so formidable in life that people believed he could command armies from beyond the grave. So what is Jan Žižka's true legacy? It is nothing less than the end of an entire era of warfare. For 1,000 years, the battlefield had been dominated by the heavily armored knight. It was an age of chivalry, where individual prowess and noble birth were paramount. Žižka shattered that world. He proved that a disciplined army of common people, armed with technology and led with brilliant tactical thinking, could defeat a numerically superior force of aristocrats. The Wagenburg was the direct ancestor of the armored personnel carrier and the tank, a mobile fortress used to protect infantry and provide fire support. His massed use of handguns signaled the dawn of the age of gunpowder, which would make knights in shining armor obsolete. He didn't just win battles, he changed the fundamental equation of war. He demonstrated that technology, discipline, and strategy would always trump bravery and brute force.
And what of his orphans? Did the Hussite cause die with him? Far from it. He had trained them so well that they were able to continue the fight for another decade without him. Led by his brilliant successor, Prokop the Great, the Hussite armies, including the orphans, went on the offensive. They launched devastating raids called glorious rides deep into enemy territory, spreading the terror of the Hussite name across Central Europe. They continued to defeat crusade after crusade. They were a military force unlike any other, forged in the vision of their blind master. The wars would eventually end, not with a decisive military defeat, but with a political compromise at the Council of Basel, where the Church finally granted the Hussites many of the religious freedoms they had fought and died for.
Today, in the Czech Republic, Jan Žižka is a national hero. A colossal statue of him, one of the largest equestrian statues in the world, stands on Vitkov Hill, the site of his greatest victory, forever watching over the city of Prague. He is remembered as a symbol of Czech resistance against foreign domination, a brilliant military leader who defended his people's faith and freedom. But he remains a controversial figure. His brutality and religious extremism are difficult to reconcile with modern values. He was both a liberator and a destroyer, a pious man of God and a ruthless warlord. He is a reminder that history is rarely simple, and its heroes are often deeply flawed and complex men.
So we return to the paradox we started with. A man who lost his sight but could see the future of warfare more clearly than anyone else. A general who led an army of amateurs to victory against the greatest professionals of his age. Jan Žižka's story is a testament to the power of innovation, adaptation, and unwavering belief. He proves that your greatest perceived weakness can be transformed into your greatest strength. He was never defeated because he refused to play by the rules. He wrote his own. And in doing so, he dragged the world kicking and screaming out of the Middle Ages and into the modern era. He was the blind general who never lost a battle, and the world would never be the same. What part of Žižka's story do you find most incredible? His tactics, his leadership while blind, or his sheer ruthlessness? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching.